This is part 3 of fallacies. So last week we talked about emotional fallacies and we talked about ethical fallacies. The last of them are the logical fallacies. So again, they align with ethos, pathos, and logos. Now we're talking about logos. Logical fallacies, the first one is hasty generalization, which is basically just like it sounds. So it's making an assumption about something. In this case, it could make assumptions about two different things. The first is making assumptions about a whole group or range of cases based on a sample that is inadequate, usually because it is atypical or just too small. So case in point. So I was talking last week about when I was the person involved in the knee study as the only person in the entire Chicago area to be approved for this test medication for osteoarthritis of the knee. And say that they were to take that sample, sorry about whatever else is on my screen here, hopefully that pop-ups and on, hopefully. All right, so I was the only person in Chicagoland in this knee study. So imagine if they released the report saying 100% of everyone who was involved in this knee study showed vast improvements in mobility in their knee and minimal side effects. So what's wrong with that picture is they're making an assumption based on an inadequate sample. One person is not an adequate sample to pass, to get a drug approved by the FDA. So that's a hasty generalization. Another type is stereotyping. Stereotyping is a hasty generalization. Examples are librarians are all shy and smart. Wealthy people are snobs, right? So you're taking out the equation because it's implied. We're saying all or most. So those are typically, common examples of a hasty generalization. Moving on to faulty causality. Again, we're not asked to memorize these, but just to know the basic concepts because we're going to be working with these this week. So from the Latin phrase, which basically means after this, therefore, because of this. So it's saying that one thing causes another to happen when that's not true. So basically, it's like a hasty generalization also combined by saying something like everybody who's going to contract COVID-19 is going to be in the hospital and at risk of dying, which we know is not true. Some people don't even realize that they have it, and asymptomatic people are the most contagious, but asymptomatic people may have been walking around with it, never facing any danger to themselves at all, right? So that's a faulty causality. So it's a fallacious assumption that because one event or action follows another, the first causes the second. The Baltimore Ravens a few years ago in the playoffs, their quarterback at the time, Joe Flacco, he grew a beard. So everybody said, well, they're winning. So as long as Joe Flacco is still growing his beard, they're going to keep winning and they're going to go all the way to the Super Bowl. They did go all the way to the Super Bowl, and he still continued to grow his beard. Of course, they lost the Super Bowl because Justin Tucker, their kicker, lost. He missed a field goal, similar to what happened to us in Chicago last year, but we won't get into that. All right, so here's an example, like I said, with Joe Flacco. So during the playoffs, every time the team has grown their beards, they have won. So if they want to keep winning, they better continue to grow their beards. That's a faulty causality. Begging the question. So it asks the reader to simply accept the conclusion without providing real evidence. The argument either relies on a premise that says the same thing as the conclusion or simply ignores an important but questionable assumption that the argument rests on. So for example, a student might say, you can't give me a C. I'm an A student. So that's begging the question. And again, these fallacies, they're called logical fallacies because they aren't very logical. Equivocation is the next one. And now you have large words that you can impress your friends and family with. Equivocation. Sliding between two or more different meanings of a single word or phrase that is important to the argument. So examples. I don't see how you can say you're an ethical person It's so hard to get you to do anything. Your work ethic is bad. So see how they're using ethical and ethic, two different meanings of the same word. Here's another one. And this one I remember vividly because I read this and I was confused. So during the school closure controversy at the time, Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel used the phrase optimize school resource utilization instead of close schools. So I'm looking at that and I'm thinking optimize, which I'm thinking, oh good, they're going to provide more resources that students can use, utilization. No, that's not what they were saying. The ambiguity of his language allowed him to avoid stating directly that his policy entailed to actually close schools. Moreover, this phrase is so ambiguous that without prior knowledge of the situation, you might actually think that his policy was the complete opposite of school closures. So you see that all the time in politics specifically, and you'll see that if you're reading a lot of articles of things that are going on right now. You can see that in a lot of news stories right now, and anything that's related to elections, anything that's related to information. We're getting a lot of conflicting information right now about the virus, and the list just goes on when it comes to equivocation. Non sequitur. This one was going to take a couple of slides to explain because it's a little confusing at first. So it's a statement that does not follow logically from what preceded it. So you notice how some of these overlap, and the reason for that is because many logical fallacies are types of non sequiturs, such as if you're right, then I'm right. As you're right, therefore I'm right. They defy the basic rules of reason and are usually based upon unsound arguments. Not only do non sequiturs fail to follow logic, but they're usually untrue, jumping to unfounded conclusions. Sound familiar? So if you remember, sorry, I skipped ahead here. So you remember when I had you watching that video of Betsy DeVos with the school closures, how she was in an appeal to false authority. So again, she's jumping to an unsound conclusion, and that's a form of a non sequitur as well. Not only do non sequiturs fail to follow logic, but they also, in conversation, they seem absurd. They're often causing confusion due to a lack of understanding. So here are some examples of that. In the non sequiturs below, you'll see they either don't follow a line of logic or they're potentially fallacies. My refrigerator is acting up. I better finish that book by Friday. Right? There's no connection. So see, segmented. I read about a pit bull attack. Our neighbor owns a pit bull, so my life is in danger. Just because the one pit bull was dangerous and that pit bull attack doesn't mean that all pit bulls are dangerous, right? And it doesn't mean that your neighbor's pit bull is dangerous. Your neighbor's pit bull can be the sweetest dog on earth, no. I had a crazy professor in college. All professors are crazy. Well, yeah, pretty much I am. I don't know about the rest of them, but Dave was arrested for a DUI 10 years ago. He's definitely an alcoholic. Those are non sequiturs. Assumptions too, right? Okay, straw man fallacy. The arguer I can't talk now. The arguer sets up a weak version of the opponent's position and tries to score points by knocking it down. The straw man arguments are basically common in politics. So it's a rhetorical trick of politicians to respond to their opponent's positions by really going out of their way to distort what the other person's saying. This serves as a dual purpose. The first one is it undermines their opponents in the eyes of the public. The second one is it causes their opponents to waste a lot of time responding to the distortion rather than advocating on behalf of their real position. So those are straw man fallacies, and I'll provide you with some examples. So because we live in basically a media culture now, more so now than ever, we're constantly surrounded by politics. So we're also now surrounded by straw man arguments. As a result, we see the frequent repetition of political straw man arguments in popular discourse. So here's a couple of common ones that we see. And you'll, just by looking at these, you can imagine very similar arguments that are kind of arbitrary arguments that have stood the test of time that people just don't give up on. So, for example, a conservative would say, most of the proposed regulations to reduce carbon emissions are unduly burdensome for businesses and ineffective. And a liberal would say in response, you're prioritizing big businesses over the environment and denying that climate change is a real problem. All right, another example. A liberal would say, I think the U.S. should institute a ban on owning assault weapons to curtail some of the mass shootings. A conservative would say in response, so do you think that we should take away people's guns and abolish the Second Amendment? Those are actually straw man arguments. All right, and the last of the logical fallacies is called a faulty analogy. They're comparisons that give ideas greater presence. They're ways of understanding unfamiliar ideas by comparing them with something that's already known. They can be proven false if two things that are being compared aren't really alike. And here's a great example of this. Guns are like hammers. They're both tools with metal parts that could be used to kill someone, and yet it would be ridiculous to restrict the purchase of hammers. So restrictions on purchasing guns are equally ridiculous, right? Apples and oranges. That's what it is. So that's a faulty analogy. They don't make any sense because they're completely different things. All right, those are the logical fallacies.